It's 10:03 and I have a feeling people will trickle in this morning. No worries there, but we can get started. As always, I'm Emily Weiler with the Montana Public Health Training Center. I'm here today with Ivy Anderson of the Parenting Place to talk about ACEs and trauma, and especially for healthcare and our public health nurses. So we're excited to have you today. This is always a very popular topic and a very important one. So I'm always excited to see so many people show up. I will be here the whole time, even if my camera's off, I'm still here. We'll encourage you to either talk if you want or use the chat, and I'll be monitoring the chat the whole time so nothing will get missed. If you get booted for any reason, no problem. Go back to that Zoom link. I'll let you back in. And I will say that we are recording today, but do know that, and anything, if you share any personal stories or anything like that, we will edit that out. So don't hesitate to be engaged and share. We just want to record the main content from the trainer that we'll send out then to the attendees afterward. So with that, I will turn it over to the lovely Ivy and we'll get going.
Great, thanks, Emily. Hi, everybody. My name is Ivy Anderson. I'm with the Parenting Place. If you're unfamiliar with us, we are sorry, everybody, you'll have to bear with me. I'm actually ill today, but I didn't want to cancel on anybody. So that's why my voice sounds like this. But yeah, the Parenting Place is a nonprofit child abuse prevention center. And the main things that we do there are teach parenting courses within the community and at places like the jail and the pre-release center here. And we also give these types of trainings. So we talk a lot about ACEs and how we can better provide trauma-informed care just in our daily lives. So I'll talk a little bit about what trauma is and all of that. And then towards the end, we're going to get into how you can apply this in your field. So like Emily said, yeah, just you can put something in the chat or just raise a hand. You don't have to wait till the end to answer or ask questions. I'll leave some time though at the end for questions and feedback. But I appreciate everybody being here. Thanks so much for signing up. So before we begin, I like to remind people just about emotional safety of everybody in the group. So I encourage everybody, I know we're only here for 2 hours, but if you need to take a break and step away, a lot of this information can feel really heavy, I think. And so if you feel triggered at any point, that it's okay to just walk away for a little bit, or even if you have to leave the training, that's okay. I have this analogy on here of skipping the stone. That just means that it's while we want people to be able to talk about trauma and share, for today, I'll just ask, for the emotional safety of everybody in the group, that if we do have something to share, we kind of stick to the point that we want to make, rather than, like this says, sink the stone by going into too many details, which can sometimes trigger other people. Oops, okay, I was trying to admit somebody else. So this is what we're here for today. We're going to talk about what trauma is, why it matters, and then how to be trauma informed, and not only trauma informed, but trauma responsive. So that just means taking the information that we learn and putting it into practice. And not only just, with our jobs, but with even our family, with our friends, how can we think about this so that we're not re-traumatizing people? And I'll get into that here in a little bit, but what it means to be re-traumatized. But I have this quote up here that I think is important, because when people wonder why this matters, it's because with trauma, this is often what we do. We avoid, ignore, belittle, deny. It's misunderstood. And it's an untreated cause of human suffering. And so we're going to get into, how can we help people kind of heal with it and know what our role is in that healing process. Because often, the reason this, I think, like Emily was saying, is such a popular topic is because trauma is very common and it's not going away, right? We have this study that I'm going to talk about. You guys are probably familiar with it, but the ACE study was done, over 20 years ago, and we still haven't, like, as a society, really done anything about it necessarily. So we're just kind of stuck in this cycle of trauma, um, and it's unhealthy, So yeah, we want to be able to talk about trauma rather than put it under the rug and just kind of hide from it because we're uncomfortable with it. So often people want to know what's the definition of trauma, and that it's hard because it is so individual. If you look up what is trauma, you'll find different definitions where it's like an event that is super stressful and affects one's behavior or their actual physical body. But I like to point out that like this says, it's just highly individual. One situation that a person could easily recover from might be traumatic for another person. And those, are as simple as like losing a pet. We all are kind of like, oh, that's, something that most everybody goes through and can recover from. But for other people, it might be, the kind of the last thing that they're able to ever like heal from. So it's, again, we don't want to project this, like Kayleen Soma here says, that it's not that bad, because it's really about how people are feeling, based on what's happened, and how they're learning to cope and heal from it. So it's hard to kind of define it. I think Bessel van der Kolk kind of says it best here. If you're familiar with the book, The Body Keeps the Score, it's all about how our body stores unresolved trauma. So yeah, Bessel van der Kolk is the author of that book, and this is his quote here. It says, people talk about trauma as an event that happened a long time ago, but what trauma is the imprints that the event has left on your mind and in your sensations, the discomfort you feel, the agitation, the rage, the helplessness you feel right now, right? So I think that's important, so that when we're thinking about defining it, it's to the individual. We can't define somebody else's trauma without asking them to tell us. So to kind of understand this in a medical way, we always refer back to the ACE study, and I'm sure many of you have heard of this. And maybe in a show of hands, if people know how to use that little icon, can people, if you have heard of it, can you guys raise hands or just nod? Okay, I see a few people are raising hands, nodding. Okay, so there's quite a few people that have already heard of this. Good. I like that, because sometimes when I give these trainings, like, nobody's ever heard of this, and it's like, oh no, because it's been, this study was done in the early 90s, and we still aren't really using it. So I'm happy to see that there are a lot of people that are familiar with it already. So because of that, I'll just do a brief little background for, excuse me, for those of you that maybe haven't heard of it or are maybe not well versed in it. These two guys here, the key investigators, the doctors here, Robert Anda and Vincent Felitti, were working together. Basically, Robert Anda worked for the CDC and Vincent Felitti was working for Kaiser. And I like to point that out because this study is what they call the largest public health study of all time, because they were able to get these 17,000, it was actually closer to 17,500 participants. And the reason they had access to that many people is because all of them had Kaiser's insurance, right? So that's how they had access to their medical records. They were able to sit down and ask them a stack of questions about like their childhood and just health questions. And what they found is that people who've experienced trauma in early childhood, basically like the first 18 years of life, have an increased risk of health issues later in life. So anything that has to do with health, our behavioral health, mental health, physical, emotional, even our spiritual health can be impacted by trauma. One thing that I didn't mention earlier, this study of these 17,500 people, I already talked about how they all had Kaiser's insurance, but it was 50% men, 50% women, majority were white. I think it was like 70% were white. And also, most of them had a college degree. So I think that's interesting when we talk about trauma, because often we like to be like, it's the us versus them, like, oh, that's those people on the other side of the tracks over there, stay away from over there. But if this is happening in upper middle class white America, this is happening everywhere. So I think we need to, remove that kind of stereotype, that trauma only happens to certain groups, because this study just debunked that. Okay, so I think I took out the screener, or maybe it's the next slide, sorry. Basically what they found, I mean, I always say this list could go out the door when we talk about health issues, but any type of health issue you can think of, most of the time is related to stress, right? It's like 95% of all disease comes from stress. That's what the ACE study is studying, is somebody's stress levels. And so when we look at all the different types of, health problems, whether it's behavioral or this physical and mental health problems, it can be linked back to toxic stress or trauma. Sometimes people like to think about, I've had people say like, I don't really like the word trauma. Can you use the word adversity? It's like, well, that's what it is. So we can use the words interchangeably. It's adversity, trauma, toxic stress, kind of all mean the same thing. It's again, it's how the individual though defines it for themselves. Okay, I guess I did leave this in here. I won't, oh, it's kind of hard to see too. Sorry, everybody. I won't read through every single one of these. These are just, this is what from the original study, they call this the ACE screener. So when they asked people, like, did you experience this or that in the first 18 years of your life? These were the top 10 questions that people said yes to. So I won't read through all those, but they are broken out into these three categories. So it was, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, and then household challenges. Sometimes you'll see this in the older studies, they were calling it household dysfunction. But then they found that if we're going to be trauma informed, the word dysfunction is kind of triggering for people. So they use the word household, they say challenges instead. And those were living with somebody who had a mental health issue that wasn't being treated, experiencing, an incarceration, having a relative incarcerated. In the original study, they were only looking at domestic violence toward the mother, but because this study has been replicated many times all throughout the States and even globally, they found that just witnessing violence in general, it could in the home, it could be, siblings against sibling, or mom against dad, or mom or dad against siblings. It's just witnessing violence, right? And then, substance use disorder, this should probably be updated too. We now know that we don't call it substance abuse, it's substance use disorder. And then also experiencing divorce. So those were the top 10 adverse experiences that people reported, they had experienced, in the first 18 years of their life. So one other piece of information, I'm not sure everybody, if this is repeat, I'm sorry, I will speed this along because I have a lot of information for you guys today. But what they found in the study is that once we get one ACE, there's an 87% chance we'll get a second one, and they might even happen at the same time. And that just is, to show how interrelated they are. So the example I always give is, if I am witnessing violence in my house, there's one ACE. The chance that then I'm directly going to experience that violence, there's the second one, right? So that's kind of how the idea is to prevent any ACEs from happening at all, um, because they build upon each other pretty quickly. But also, this is kind of hard to see too, sorry. Because this study, like I keep saying, it was done in the early, 90s, they've come up with more research and information. And what they have found is that people can experience adversity or trauma within the household here. And these are those like 10 things, that were on the original screener. But we can also experience trauma in our community. And so those things weren't really asked in the original questionnaire. But a lot of people, as they, have talked about this more and more with people are saying that these are often common traumas too. So experiencing, racism, discrimination, violence, historical trauma, which we'll talk about, lack of, jobs or food, poverty, right? I don't think I need to read through all of those, but so that's the second way where people are experiencing trauma. But then also within our environment, things that are out of our control there sometimes, like this says, wildfires, smoke, just the climate crisis. We can all probably identify with this one, the pandemic here, and again, it's up to the individual, because I've talked to people who are like, no, I was totally fine staying at home and being isolated and being with my family. And other people were like, this is the worst thing. Like, I need to, get out of my house. So, and then there's more than just, the isolation piece that comes with it. It's also, people experiencing death and grief and loss. And also for, seeing that, and I probably more so in the field that everybody here works in, if we're constantly working with people and seeing their symptoms or watching people, go through hardship, we can kind of have that secondary, stress, traumatic stress too. So it's just something to think about, that it's in the original study, they were just looking at the household, but now we know that people, especially with things like the historical trauma, people are being traumatized by outside, just the home, in our environment, in our communities. So they did come up with a second screener, and that's what this is. This was actually made for a child. So a parent fills it out on behalf of the child. So they did add some of those things that we saw from the last slide. So these are the 10, core ones that happen within the home, but then they added these ones that were being reported as being common for children. So experiencing foster care, harassment, bullying. I don't think I need to read all of them again, just for time's sake, but it's just to know that there are more than just 10 things that people can be traumatized by. I've worked with people who have asked me like, well, I watched somebody, like die right in front of me. Does that count? It's like, yes, that is a traumatic experience. It's just not one of the top common ones, right? So people could have an ACE score of 1,000. It's just when it comes to surveying people, these are the ones that people report most often, if that makes sense. And I like to point out that we never want to make people feel like they're their number, like, what's your ACE score? That's who you are. I think it's only for us to gauge how much stress a person is under, because if you look at the dose response relationship within this study, it's basically the dose response is, you guys probably know this already, but it's basically that algorithm of like, the more gas I put in my car, the farther I'm going to be able to go. When we put the ACE data into that, it's the more ACEs I have, the higher my risk becomes for health issues, right? So they kind of build on each other that way. So that can be some, importance there for screening people, but we also don't have to know what people's specific traumas are in order to provide, care for them too. Um, but this is kind of a repeat of what I was talking about in the beginning, that this trauma is individual. So I always point out that it's somebody's perception is what matters, right? Perception is everything. So the example I like to give about that is, I have a couple different ones. So one, it could be, two children grow up in the same exact household, parents divorce, and when you ask the children, about that, one might be severely traumatized by it, and another might be like, yeah, I'm glad, right? So it's all about how a person perceives what's happening. Another example could be a car crash. Two people could have the same exact car crash, and one might walk away being a little bit shaken up, like, ooh, that was kind of scary, but they don't think about it. It's not haunting them day after day, right? The next person with the car crash might never want to drive again, right? So it's, again, we can't define what somebody's trauma means to them. So I'm sure everybody has heard of this, the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn responses. But the problem with this is that, it's good, obviously, if there's a bear, we need this response to work, right? We need that adrenaline, that cortisol to pump through our bloodstream to help us get out of that situation. Because that's really what the brain is designed to do, is to keep us alive. It wants to keep us safe. So that this response is very useful. It's just the problem is that the body doesn't recognize the difference between a bear and my teacher yelling at me, right? Or a bear and my dad coming home angry from work. It will respond in the same way. I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with this, the little hand model that I always talk about. But I'll just show you. This was developed by this Dr. Dan Siegel, and he's actually a neurologist who writes books on parenting, right? And so because I'm the parenting place, this is what we teach our parents to help even their children as young as 5 and 6 understand what's happening in the brain when we get stressed out. So we have our brainstem here, that's taking in all the information that we really don't have to think about. If a ball is kicked at my face, it's my brainstem that's going to kick in and help me to move, right? It controls things like our breathing or heart rate, all those things that we just really don't have to think about, but need to survive, right? And then in the middle here, we have our limbic system. That's the fight, flight, freeze center. On here, it shows the hippocampus and the amygdala are located also in that center, the limbic system. Sometimes people call it the leopard brain or survival brain. And then covering all of that, this says the cerebral cortex. Sometimes it's called the neocortex, but really this is our higher thinking, power of our brain, the executive branch. It helps us plan things. It helps us use logic and reasoning, language. It helps us learn. So basically, we like to feel like this, right? There's rest, digest, and then there's fight, flight, freeze. So what happens is anytime we get stressed out, I'll go back to this slide. What happens is I flip my lid. I know that sounds kind of cheesy, but we're not functioning anymore in, the higher learning power of our brain. We're only in survival mode, which is good for us, right? If I'm running from this bear. But what happens to the body after about 20 minutes is that cortisol starts to toxify my blood, right? So when we think about the ACE, study, and why is it that, stress and trauma affect our health, it's because of this response. It's overactivated all the time. We're not meant to run around stressed out all day long, right? I know people that function like that, and they're still, doing a great job, getting their, work done, parenting. They're just stressed out, and it's unhealthy because it's taxing on the body. And, when we have that toxicity in our bloodstream going to all of our systems, we're more susceptible to disease, right? So this is what I think, if there's one takeaway, I always want people to think about how we can recognize when not only, other people are flipping their lids or starting to, but noticing that for ourselves too, because that's how we're going to lower the risk for the adverse childhood experiences, or just for any sort of trauma to take a toll on us, is being in control of this response, or starting to, because we all do it, we all flip our lid. It's just being able to practice things that help us calm down. And the best thing to do really is to practice deep breathing exercises. I know it sounds silly. People are like, oh, great, we got hippie Lala in here telling us to take deep breaths. But the reason it works is because it activates this part of our, of our nervous system. A breath, is something that we're not really always in control of. We don't have to remind ourselves to breathe because of our, brain stem and our, how all that works. But when we kind of trigger our brain to think about taking a deep breath, it begins to calm our nervous system, and we stop pumping all that cortisol and adrenaline. So I think if we can, help even little kids, like I said, learn, like, let's take a deep breath, like, let's calm down, because we can't learn or do anything else until we're calm, right? So, yeah, so that's my little spiel on the stress in the brain and the stress response. I added this in here, not that we have to read through all of it, but I think when we're trying to recognize, like, if somebody is flipping their lid, sometimes it can be hard because not everybody just flips their lid in the same way. So it's sometimes helpful to kind of think about being able to recognize what people might be doing or how they might be acting. And I'll send this out to Emily too, so that she can email you guys the slides. Because, and I think this is important because often we mislabel people's fear responses. We might be like, oh, that person has ADD, when really they're just hyper vigilant because they're always checking, looking for the stress, right? So I think it's really important that we, and again, it's not to say that people don't have some of these disorders. It's just that we don't want to mislabel things. So I'll get this out to you too, but just for time's sake, okay, we're still good. I had to see what time it was. So we know this already, right? We know ACEs are common. People are experiencing them. Just doesn't matter what our socioeconomic status is, what our background is at all. It's just pretty much everybody you talk to has at least one ACE, right? And then I think it was 2/3 of the study had at least one. And then I can't remember the exact facts. Sorry, Betty, I'm having some like fog brain myself. But yeah, it was once people hit 4 ACEs that we see a spike in health outcomes, right? Negative health outcomes. So, and it's not to say necessarily that it's a crystal ball, like if you have 4, you're going to have heart disease, it's just that we're more at risk once we hit 4 or more. So yeah, we know that they're common, they're interrelated that way. And also, I think, this is kind of catching on, this intergenerational transmission of ACEs. Sometimes people call it historical trauma. But I don't know if people always really understand it. Like how I always get people that are like, how do you know that we pass down, our trauma? Like, how can you study that really? And it's a field called epigenetics, but I won't get into all the ins and outs of that because I really am not a neurologist. But I will say that, and if people have been to one of my trainings before, you've probably have heard me give this example, but the way I usually break it down for people so that they can understand how we're passing this down is just an example that of a study that they did, or basically an experiment involving mice. And I don't know how ethical this is. This might, be hard to hear too, but what they did was they took a group of mice and had them in, cages. And what they would do is shock them through the wires into their little feet. And while they were doing that, they would release a cherry blossom scent, right? So pretty soon they didn't have to shock them. They would just release the cherry blossom scent, and the rats had connected that, right? Or the mice. It was like, ooh, cherry blossom equals bad, equals danger, stay away from it. And they'd all freak out, right? So with that offspring, the second generation of those mice, same thing. They removed the shock, right? They didn't have to shock them. It was just the cherry blossom. And it had changed the way their DNA was written and transcribed so that they already knew, as mice, like grown-up mice, I should say that they the second generation of mice were adults when they ran this experiment on them. And it was the same thing. Cherry blossom equals danger, bad, stay away from it. And then again, with the third generation, same thing, right? So the only thing they did was changed, I should say, was to remove that actual shock. And it still took 2 generations for it to be kind of turned off, I will say, in their DNA. So that's kind of when we think about historical trauma or intergenerational trauma, that's why it happens, because again, our brain is wired for survival. So we want to pass that down to our babies, right? So this is true of even humans. I'll give some examples here in a minute, but often people don't understand that, and I hear myself, I mean, the more and more you talk about this, you'll get different comments, but people don't want to believe that this is true. And this is why I like to kind of hit it home with examples, because it is true. And we aren't removing the shock from generations. So we're still passing this down. So when people say things like, oh, slavery, that was 300 years ago, we haven't removed the shock, right? We still continue to treat people of color terribly in this country. So the shock isn't gone. So that when we talk about that, we can be walking around with, 2 generations of trauma, like our parents and our grandparents. That's only if we remove the shock. Otherwise, we have all the other ancestors, up the family tree. So I'm going to play 2 different examples here about how this kind of happens. And this first one, is from the Lakota tribe. And I'll just ask that everybody maybe, take a deep breath and kind of prepare. This can be really triggering and hard to hear. I had a friend record this for me because it's just even hard to read. But again, it's just because things are hard, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have to take a look at them. It's sometimes if we don't understand things, then we don't have a place to begin healing from. So I will play this. And again, feel free, if this is a lot, you can take a break too. If I can get this to show up here. Okay.
Each year, members of the Lakota tribe and their allies gather in Bridger, South Dakota, and travel more than 300 kilometers on horseback in the dead of winter. The conditions are harsh. Wind and snow burn their faces and make it difficult to breathe. They travel to commemorate the journey of their ancestors. After the killing of Chief Sitting Bull by the U.S. Cavalry, Chief Bigfoot led approximately 350 Lakota, mostly women and children, on what he hoped would be a journey to the safety of the Pine Ridge Reservation. Instead, they were intercepted by the U.S. Army. Their group submitted peacefully and made camp along Wounded Knee Creek. On the morning of December 29th, 1890, a shot rang out and chaos ensued. Those who tried to flee were pursued and executed by U.S. soldiers. Children who hid were coaxed to come out and then were killed. All told, more than 250 Lakota were massacred. Although this tragedy took place more than 100 years ago, its impact remains. The ongoing pain from the genocide of the Lakota and numerous other acts against Native American communities has been described as a soul wound. It is what drives the Lakota horse riders in their search for both personal and communal healing. The past weaves intricately through modern life, and in some ways, communities are still trying to recover.
Okay, thank you everybody for listening to that. I know it's heartbreaking to hear, and I think to call it a soul wound is the best way to describe how deep that actually is, and for us to say things like, oh, just get over it, like my people didn't do that to you. That happened so long ago. That when I'm talking about like a shock, that is an example of a shock. When people have to wake up on a reservation every day, that is a shock. It's a reminder of feeling less than because of the US government, right? So I think it's important to just always keep this into consideration, when we're working with people and talking with people and educating other people about this. Excuse me. I will say that the one thing that's different in here is this PTSS, post-traumatic slave syndrome. All of these other ones are just, transgenerational, intergenerational, multi-generational, cross-generational are all the same kind of words that we use interchangeably for historical trauma. But post-traumatic slave syndrome is a little bit different because it's about the African American experience. So I put in a clip here from the woman, the doctor. Her name is Dr. Joy DeGruy, and she actually came up with this PTSS. She has a book. It's just called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome that I recommend people read, but I thought I would put her.
Each year, members.
Sorry, everybody. Don't need to do that twice. So yeah, I thought it better to have her explain it than me because this isn't my experience. So, and it's something I'm still learning about, but this is just a short clip. I think it's actually like 4 or 5 minutes long that explains, post-traumatic slave syndrome a little bit better than I can, because this is something new to even me. So don't feel bad if you've never heard of this either. When I talk about this, most people haven't heard of it or don't know how to define it or what it looks like. So I'll go ahead and play this. Hopefully this works.
Post-traumatic slave syndrome is an explanatory theory that really looks at multi-generational trauma. One of the things that's difficult for people is their first response is, oh my God, that happened so long ago. We're talking about people being captured, shipped, sold, beaten, raped, experimented on. And then you have to ask the question, did the trauma continue? Yes. So 300 years of trauma, no help, freed, no help, more trauma. If it's a sustained trauma, then the impact of that is also sustained. When we look at multi-generational trauma, we're looking at people who are maybe victims of natural disasters and their families and their children and generations of folks who have experienced war. And we know that there are residual mental, emotional, traumatic impact. And what I did was I started to look at the African-American experience, starting with slavery as a real clear, long enduring traumas. I started to see that there were clear connections between that survival behavior and contemporary living in African-American experience. I started to see common behaviors that I took for granted as, well, cultural. There's adaptive behaviors, survival behaviors. Well, what are they? Let's just say 2019, you have a Black mother and a white mother. The sons go to school together. They find themselves at a meeting. The Black mother leans over to the white mother and says, I just wanted to mention to you that I noticed that your son is really doing quite well. And the white mother's response is, oh, thank you. She begins to go on and on about he won the science fair, his uncle's an astronaut. She's just oozing. She realizes the black mother's son is actually excelling her son. And she says, well, wait a minute, your son's the one that's really coming along. And the black mother responds, oh my God, he's a handful, but oh, he just works my nerves. Now, when I'm working with African-American people, it doesn't matter what the audience is. It doesn't matter what class. If I were to ask, is she very proud while she's saying those denigrating things? And everybody laughs and goes, of course, there's a secret. Because everybody black knows that even though the black mother is going, oh my God, she's really proud. So now let's roll that scene back 300 years. And let's say this black mother is working in the fields and a white slave owner comes through and says, wow, that boy is really coming along. What is she gonna say? No, he's not. He's stupid. He's shiftless. He can't work because I don't want you to sell him. So I denigrate them to protect them. That is called appropriate adaptation when living in a hostile environment. The little white boy, say Timmy, you know, he feels really comfortable and happy about what his mom just said about him. And Trey looks at his mom and wonders, why can't you be proud of me? Because he doesn't understand the secret yet. And by the time he learns the secret, he will have already been injured by it. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. PTSD is a disorder that occurs as a result of a single trauma. You don't even have to be there to actually get a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. You could just hear about something horrific happening to someone you love. So you have people who have experienced it firsthand, people who have witnessed it in their environment, right? People who are continuing to be oppressed. That exacerbates any possibility of healing. So it's not post-traumatic stress disorder, because then it becomes part of what we call your socialization process. So you begin to normalize a way of living and being, everything from what we eat to what we believe it means to be a friend. You know, all of these things are colored by history. And if you don't understand it, you're going to fold in things that you've just assumed are normal. But post-traumatic stress disorder, you know, exaggerated startle response, outbursts of anger, feeling of foreshortened future. There was a point where there were, you know, African-American children in different urban settings that didn't expect to live to be adults because they saw so much death, that they started planning their funerals like at 13, 12, as young as 10. When you start looking at the simple biology, you start looking at the impact of stress on health. And while we look at general stress, you know, finances, you have illnesses, all these different things. How about being black? How does factoring in being black in America impact your stress level and therefore your body's ability to operate its own immune system? Because we know it compromises the immune system. Once you understand it, then you can deal with it. Because you see, it's habitual. You socialize. It becomes part of your being. So one of the ways you begin to address that multi-generational trauma is to work with the people it directly impacts, to hear from them. And when you give the people the information, they can use it. I think the first order of business is beginning to have a conversation. And the other is to educate the larger society. You have to stop the assault. So this is not purely a clinical thing. This requires social justice and change. That's where part of the healing is. It's not in a clinical setting or in a pill. It's in fairness and justice and safety and equity. We got to work with some of those clinical things, some of those issues of panic and anxiety. And we also have to deal with the fact that you have a system that is set up to oppress you and to continue to injure you. Both those things have to be dealt with. And they cannot singularly by themselves affect a change. They have to be done collectively. Post-traumatic slave.
Sorry, everybody that wants to play it twice each time. Well, I hope that kind of answer. I know it's a lot deeper than that. I just love her, and I think that she does a good job kind of breaking it down in a short amount of time into what that looks like. I like that the end where she talks about it's not just a single issue, you know, but also that this is why we want to give this information to people, because if people don't know this, then they can't use it, right? And we can't change things. So, yeah, I always recommend, you know, reading her book. if you can. I have at the end of this, I have resources and stuff that you guys can go back to, so you don't have to write all this down. But I have this slide here, another pandemic, even though, this has been going on even before COVID, just this racial injustice. And I have one example here from Hurricane Katrina on just how this kind of plays out. When we talk about the shock, of like not being able to heal from trauma, it's because even just little things like this can be a shock to somebody reading these newspaper articles. So as you can see on the left here, we have, a white couple, they found bread and soda, whereas, this young Black child is looting, right? So it's these stereotypes and these implicit biases that we have that kind of keep this cycle, of racial injustice going. So I didn't put this down in the resources at the end. So if you do want to write this down, I always recommend that people Google, you can just type in Harvard implicit bias, and it'll take you to a set of tests. I think there's like 16 of them that are all different. I mean, it has to do with things like our feelings about gender roles, our feelings about ageism, sexism, racism, body type. And I think it's really important because, when I first did those tests, I was like, oh, I'm going to pass all of these. I did not, it was like, ooh, I learned that, it's these subliminal kind of like messages that we receive over and over. Like, even if we're like, nope, I don't believe that, they're kind of deeply ingrained. So one of the examples that I failed on was the test showed that I believe that women are better in the home and men are better at working and jobs like math and science. It was like, oh no, that's not what I really want to believe, but it's those messages that we're told over and over through media, just, our everyday life. So if you have time, I would say, try to get through all 16 of those, because it's really interesting to learn. If we're not aware of what our, what some of our stereotypes or some of our biases might be, we're going to be repeating harm, right? So I think it's really important to take the time. I'm not saying you have to sit down and do all 16 at once, because they do take, a few minutes each, or I would say about 10 minutes each, but it's important to do. So I put this quote in here. I have a lot of quotes. I like to use quotes, but Charles M. Blow, he is a journalist for the New York Times. He writes a lot about social justice issues. And this is quote here. So it says, one doesn't have to operate with great malice to do great harm. The absence of empathy and understanding is sufficient, right? That's why we continue to do this work, to educate ourselves, to constantly be learning. I won't say that I even feel like I'm a trauma expert, even though I've been teaching this. There's always something new to learn. And I think the more and more we do that research and try to take trainings and talk with people, the less harm we're going to be creating then. Okay, so switching gears just a little bit, we're going to talk about re-traumatization. It's a word that people aren't really all that familiar with. They're like, what does that mean? It's basically, this is our definition here. It's a situation, attitude, interaction, or environment that replicates the events or dynamics of the original trauma and triggers those overwhelming feelings and reactions, right? So sometimes it can be really obvious, we can re-traumatize somebody, obviously. Let's say we, put a rape victim in restraints, right? That's obviously going to re-traumatize them. But a not so obvious example would be, let's say I close the door, like I bring somebody into my office, close the door and kind of like sit in front of it. might, because I'm thinking like, oh, we just need a little privacy in here. I'll be by the door so nobody can like come in. But for somebody who's been maybe blocked inside a room, or abused behind a closed door, we wouldn't necessarily know that unless they told us that. So it's, it would be not so obvious that they feel like, oh, this is replicating an event where I'm feeling these emotions again, So with that, in those situations where it's not so obvious, it's usually unintentional, right? I like to give people the benefit of the doubt. We're not out here trying to re-traumatize people. But there are times when it is intentional, and so we want to be aware of that as well. But regardless, it's always hurtful. That's why one of the goals is to avoid re-traumatizing somebody. So I'll talk about, kind of how we can do that a little bit better. But we have to be aware first, of how the systems are set up to re-traumatize people, right? We don't really care. A lot of the time we're like, well, this is how it's working. Our policies and procedures make it this way. So we don't make a lot of changes. And that's harmful, right? So one example I usually give, which is appropriate for this setting too, is in a doctor's office, right? We often run the risk of re-traumatizing people who have to tell their story over and over again and nothing's done about it, right? So usually, even if they're not telling their trauma story, having to retell even simple little things. So like, let's say we, this kind of how it plays out. So I call, right, to schedule an appointment. I tell the receptionist what I need and they, set me up with an appointment. I get there, I fill out all my paperwork and then wait to be called back. I'm finally taken to the exam room. I talk with a nurse and basically, tell them everything that's on my chart. They enter it in, then they leave the room and I wait around for the doctor. You think like they're maybe hopefully talking to each other about what you filled out and what was said. The doctor comes back in and then you have to repeat everything you already just said, right? For somebody who doesn't have a trauma history of not feeling seen or heard, it's mildly annoying. It's like, okay, this is the way it is. I know what to expect. But for somebody who, has had that experience, especially if it's been over and over again, it limits their capacity to really receive care, right? If this is how I feel every time I come into a doctor's office, I'm not coming back anymore, right? I don't want this care because I don't, our brain is trying to just make us or help us survive. And if I'm being triggered left and right, even with something as simple as a, doctor's appointment, I'm going to avoid going, So it's not to like shame systems. It's just, we really need to take a look at how can we avoid doing this, right? So I won't go through all of these things for time's sake, but these are just common system changes that need to happen on, the management or leadership level, because it's not our job to necessarily tell the leaders like, hey, we shouldn't be doing this anymore. We can, but it needs to be like from the top down type of change that happens. And I'll get more into that here too. So this was really helpful for me when I first started learning about trauma-informed care, is, to define what our role is, because often we want to take on all of these, right? And I will say the top two can be for everybody. Everybody in the entire community should be trauma-informed and trauma sensitive. That just means knowing that there is trauma and being sensitive to people about it. Often I hear people, it's like, oh, we got to be sensitive about everything now. We got to tiptoe around everybody's feelings and it's just like, why? It's not hard to be kind. It's one thing, for for us to feel like we have to tiptoe around all the time. I don't think that's necessarily what it's about. It's when we know about trauma and how easily it is for people to be re-traumatized, it is our job then to educate other people around us about that. Because I think when we come from this trauma-informed lens, we're less likely to feel then like we're having to tiptoe around everybody's feelings all the time, because we know that people's feelings matter, above all. So again, this can be for everybody, the trauma-informed and sensitive. I like to use this idea of taking a universal precautions approach. That just means that we don't have to know everybody's trauma, right? We can just assume. So the example I give about that is like with doctors or nurses, with gloves, we don't ask people like, do you have a bloodborne disease that I might need to know about? We just put the gloves on, right? To protect them and us. No questions asked. It's just, that's how we do it. That's the universe. It's a precaution that we take. And it can be the same thing when we're talking about trauma-informed care. It's great if people open up to us about a traumatic experience and feel safe enough with us to have that trust. But if we just treat everybody as if they might have trauma, then we're going to lower the risk of re-traumatization. It's not harmful to treat somebody without trauma, kindly, as if, they might. I think that's just the lens that we want to take when we're thinking about what our role is. And so the trauma specific, that's for people who we leave the healing part of trauma up to the trauma specific, role here. So that's, people who are trained in these evidence-based practices. There's more than what I have on here, but, some of them are EMDR, CBT, even mindfulness-based therapies. So it's, if we take on this role of being trauma specific and we don't have the training, then we run the risk of causing harm, right? And this was important for me to learn this because I do not have these licenses, So when people, tell me about trauma, I usually respond with, like, thank you for feeling, safe enough to share that with me. Like, how are you coping with this? Do you have, someone to talk to? We don't need to become the role of the therapist. We can make referrals. We can ask them, how they're doing. I think it's really important that we do have a list of trauma-informed therapists, or people who do provide these, or ask our, clients that we're with, provide them with some of these different, types of therapies for them to look into receiving. Because I will say, CBT might be great for one person, but not for another. So we want to, just give them some information on what it is that is involved in these therapies, and then kind of let them decide what's best for them, if that makes sense. So it's just having on hand, if this isn't our role, just having some resources that we can give readily available. Okay. So this comes from SAMHSA's website. This is what they say needs to be involved when we're providing trauma-informed care, right? So these are pretty simple, is realizing, that trauma is common and is happening. And knowing and really believing, though, too, that there are these paths for recovery, right? Being able to recognize some of those signs and symptoms, even within bigger systems, too, right? So when I talked about the flipping our lid, that it's being aware of when that's how we recognize, when somebody's starting to escalate. Or if you think back to the fight, flight, fawn, freeze, some of those behaviors, how we can recognize when somebody might be in this kind of state. And what do we do to respond to that? A lot of the time, all people really need is to, I always say, this sounds silly, but feel felt, right? People start to calm down, people start to heal when they feel heard and understood. So the best thing that we can do a lot of the time to respond to somebody is remain calm ourselves, and just be caring, empathetic, and a listener. We don't have to be there necessarily to be like, this is what you need to do. Let's make a plan, ABC. Like I said, it is good to have a list of referrals or resources that we can send people to. But we don't want to just like ignore it. We do want to respond in some way that we care, right? And then the last thing here, we already talked about this, is to resist re-traumatization, and again, we do that by taking that universal precautions approach, just putting on the glove, treating everybody as if they may have trauma, and this takes a while. I'm going to get into these core principles of trauma-informed care. I mean, when we're thinking about how do we lower the risk of re-traumatizing people, it can be a big process. When we sat down at our office, this is a whole separate training that I give for usually businesses. It's usually with the leadership involved, because the leadership needs to be involved for these things to change and take place. But we ask people to sit down and do an assessment of their policies, their procedures, their themselves, even in all of these different areas, right? So the first one, we ask people to sit down and think about safety, not just physical safety, but emotional, psychological safety too. Like, how are we providing that, right? Like, does everybody that comes through our doors, are they greeted with the same script? Maybe, maybe not. What's our tone? What does the environment look like? Do we have pictures on the walls that represent other cultures? Do we have reading things that are available in different languages? It can be even as simple as like, what does the lighting look like? Is it harsh, bright lights, or do we have calm music playing? So there's many things that go into safety. It can be even as simple as like knowing where the exits are, knowing where the bathrooms are located, right? So when we are trying to like change our organization into a trauma-informed organization, it is a lot of work, right? And so I don't want people to think like it's just like, oh, snap your fingers and now we're trauma-informed. It's everybody getting together and thinking about these things and making changes. At the parenting place, we have a building in the back that is not ADA compliant, right? So we know like we cannot hold meetings back here in this space because there isn't a ramp, the doors aren't wide enough, the bathroom isn't up to code, so those are things that we actually have to change and work on. So anyway, that's safety. That's, of course, safety's number one, because if people don't feel safe somewhere, none of these other things are going to happen. These things all kind of play off of each other. So yeah, what do you think, Emily? Sorry, do you think do we need to take a little break or something?
You totally knew why I popped up. I was like, oh, we're at that, like about that hour mark.
Yeah, I feel like it's a lot. And then this is like even more, information. So should we take like 5-10 minutes?
Yeah. What are people thinking? 10 minutes work? 10 is great. Okay.
So we'll be back at like 11:17.
Perfect.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks,
I think we have about a minute left. So hope everybody get to walk around, maybe stretch a little bit, do breathing exercise, get some water or coffee.
I pet a cat. That's good.
Uh, that is a good way to decompress. Pet therapy.
Exactly.
Great. Well, we'll just get started back into this again. These are the guiding principles of trauma-informed care. So we talked about safety. The second one, the trustworthiness and transparency. That is, if we're thinking about how do we assess this for ourselves and for, our office or our organization, it's just making sure that we're always open and honest, with everything that's going on. If we're, let's say, a mandated reporter, it's letting our clients know what that means and kind of getting their understanding of it back from them. It's also, if we have like treatment plans that we're making up with them, it's just being very clear about what that looks like. I know this is different for, every agency or every field. So it's important to sit down and just talk about like, how can we be open and transparent in all of our interactions? Because when people feel like something's being done kind of behind their back or without their say, it closes them off from receiving care, right? And or even if you think about relationships, think about, if you feel like somebody's hiding things from you or lying, we don't, again, feel safe. We're probably not going to have a positive, interaction or relationship from that point on. It's hard to repair trust once it's been broken. And when we're thinking about healthcare, oftentimes people will either avoid services altogether or look elsewhere, right? So that's the second one. The third one is offering peer support. And again, this looks different within organizations, but I know that, for example, I work with Partnership for Children quite a bit, and they have a peer support specialist there who helps individuals navigate through whatever it is that they're experiencing, because that person also has lived experience. So whether it's somebody who has struggled with substance use disorder in the past, they have a peer support specialist to help somebody who's experiencing that same thing. Or it could be somebody who's maybe navigated the Child and Family Services or Child Protection Services system. They have a peer support who can walk them through what that looks like as far as like court hearings. But it can also be just as simple as having time to debrief, within your office with other people that you're working with. Like, I had a really hard client, like making sure that that is set up for people so we don't have to just feel alone. So that's the peer support. Collaboration, obviously, nobody likes just being told what to do or not having a voice in things. So we want to make sure that that is set up within our office to make sure that we are providing that to not only our clients or our patients, but also we're receiving that with the leadership. Like, we're able to talk about things, that changes that might need to happen, or what's going well, what isn't. There has to, when we have that power dynamic, things don't always go so well. We do know that that exists. There is always that understanding there, but the more we can level it, the better for everybody. And then obviously empowerment. I like to think of this the same thing, as the universal precautions with the gloves. We don't have to assume that people are struggling to feel empowered, but it doesn't hurt to empower everybody. And that's just, letting people know that we see their strengths, that they are the expert in their own life. And often, when people feel empowered, they are better able to be resilient and heal, right? So if we can just empower people left and right, we're going to see changes in their ability to, overcome trauma and just be healthier. And then this last one, this humility, we used to call it cultural competence. And then they realized, like, I can't just take a class on Native American studies or African American studies and be culturally competent, right? So it's called cultural humility. And this also includes, more than just, race and class. It's also, we want to think about just any member who's being marginalized or oppressed. So bringing people in to provide that type of training. Let's say we work with, a large LGBTQ plus, population. We need somebody with that lived experience to train us on those issues, right? So it's asking for the expertise in the field to get these trainings from. So I always say, the more and more trainings we can get, the better. It's not just like, oh, I had one of those, one and done. It's an ongoing, lifelong learning, I will say. So this is the idea here with these key principles of trauma-informed care. And it's just constantly, I think, doing that self-reflection, like, how well am I doing in all of these areas? Because it starts with us, right? And then it's also, how well is my organization doing within these guidelines here? I will say, often people find this hard if leadership isn't involved in making changes, because it really is their role to address, any issues. And to begin this process, it has to start within, right? So the employees need to be taken care of first, because without that, it's hard for us to give care left and right, to others when we're not being taken care of. We can't ask people to self-sacrifice and not have those things in place, those guiding principles. If I don't feel safe in my office, I'm not going to be able really to help other people feel safe there either, right? So that's where it begins, is that leadership role. So I will say with that, because we do know that, any helping profession, you run the risk of secondary or vicarious trauma, and that needs to be addressed within policies and procedures. We actually had to rewrite ours at the parenting place because it just over the years wasn't in there, right? So we're now seeing that this, has to happen. So again, it's not to shame people like, you're not doing this in your workforce, but once we know the information, like, ooh, this isn't being done, then we can take steps to improve it. So it's writing things into the policies, that provide these things. It's as simple as beginning with like allowing staff to take breaks when they want. It's not like, oh, you still have 15 minutes till you can take a break. If we know that this work is stressful, and sometimes we work with people who are flipping their lid and it's difficult, to remain calm, especially maybe we're running on a low, night's sleep, or we're not feeling very well ourselves, or we have our own things going on. So it's really important that that flexibility is there so that people can take care of themselves, and that we have sufficient staffing. I constantly hear that that's a problem. It's like, I'm doing 3 people's jobs, and it's like, that's not okay, So again, this comes down to like leadership, whoever's in that role of making sure that this stuff is happening. And sometimes I think even just sitting down, again, it would feel more comfortable if management, took the reins on asking people to sit down and think about situations when they're at work, of when they're triggered, when they feel like they're needing a break, to calm down, and address those things. so that it is a safe work environment for everybody, where people aren't being burnt out and looking for new jobs because they're not supported at work, right? So if the management or leadership doesn't know this, that this is important to sit down and kind of have a conversation with everybody and kind of normalize this, is like, we need to have this happen. How can we bring it up to management? Do we feel safe enough to bring it up and say, like, hey, this needs to happen? Or do we need to bring somebody from the outside in to provide this type of training to them? So that's kind of where it all begins when we're trying to make this shift to become a trauma-informed practice or organization. But for, individuals, I think we can start here with asking, these questions. I know this seems very simple, but often it's just the little simple things that make a big difference for people. So it's just, thinking of this in all of our interactions. Does this cultivate a sense of safety? Am I showing others, and are others showing me respect? And does this build trust? I think the more and more we become self-aware, the easier this becomes, that we're not really having to check in and question ourselves all the time. It just becomes a part of like what we do every day. So I know this seems simple, and I'm very sure many of you are probably already doing this, so you can give yourselves a pat on the back. But when talking with people about, how they feel about accessing medical care, it's these little, things that make a big difference to them. It's just, even if we've met the patient more than once, always introducing ourselves again and like letting them know what we're going to be doing with them that day. I think that goes a big thing for people to just be, introduced or talked to or reminded like what the role is in their care. Obviously this goes with the safety piece of, use open, non-threatening body positioning. That's as simple as like sitting in a chair at their level, and not just standing above somebody. And also it can be like our tone of voice and just, it's all those little things that sometimes we're unaware of, in our body language. So if we kind of have a relaxed, state about us, it helps other people feel calm too. Obviously this one, verbalize what they can expect. We all like to know what to expect. That's why little kids on vacation are like, how much longer? When are we going to be there yet? We all just like to know what's to come. So if we can just break it down, even if it's as simple as like, okay, well, I'm going to see you again in 2 weeks, or, your next visit will be in 3 months. It's just those little things that help people feel prepared. We know this, always ask before touching or letting them know. We always want to protect patient privacy. So even if they have somebody that's along with them, we don't just want to assume that, we can share, test results or things like that with the other person in the room. It's, ask for permission first. And then this kind of goes along with the other things we've already talked about too, with, what you can expect, but just, using language that's clear, and consistent about the type of care that they're going to get. And that's kind of this same thing here with the plain language. It's, I'm sure everybody's learned this in medical school, that we don't want to use all of our medical terminology with people because they don't always understand. So if we have to use words or language that clients or patients are unfamiliar with, it's this teach back thing, is just try to understand, like, or get them to repeat to you their understanding of it, so we can clarify anything if they have any questions, or if they're maybe not understanding something correctly. And then this last one here, we've talked about that already, just the universal precaution. It's just, understanding that trauma is prevalent and is a huge problem, and that we can just treat everybody as if they might have trauma to lower the risk of re-traumatization. So I know these seem simple, like simple little things, but it does make a big difference. So these are just a few other just little tips here. When we're talking about stress, sometimes we don't necessarily need to give somebody a screener and be like, what are, your traumas here? But we can ask them, it doesn't mean that we have to make appointments longer or more drawn out, but just briefly checking in on how they're doing emotionally, because often, unless you're, a therapist, we're not really checking in on feelings a lot of the time. So I think it's important to kind of, ask about that, ask how they're doing. If it doesn't mean that they have to share every little bit, of information, but people that want to tell you things will tell you. If they don't want to, they don't have to, but it's worth, just asking, checking in. And I like this. I don't know if everybody has gone through a motivational interviewing training, but it's worth it if you haven't. But sometimes just providing like a little bit of education on stress and health, because some people don't know it. They don't know that, they don't know the little flipping our lid and that they can do a breathing exercise to calm down, right? So just, providing, like this says, just brief. It doesn't mean that they have to do this whole long training on trauma and stress, but just letting them know that, how important it is to do stress reduction, when ask them what that is. What does that look like for you? Do you like to walk? Do you listen to music? Do you spend time in nature? And, just educating them on how important that is to have some me time, and that it's not selfish, it's actually necessary. And we talked about this one already, just making referrals when necessary, and having that list on hand. And then follow up, the next time you see them. It's like, oh, I remember last time you said you were, struggling with this, or this was going really great. How are things now? It means a lot to people to have you remember, something about them. And then this last one is just engage in shared decision making. That kind of goes with the one of those principles of the collaboration and the empowerment. It's whenever possible, make sure that they're part of the decision making process. We're not just going to say, and it again can be as simple as like, what day of the week works best for you, to come back again, instead of, well, we'll see you Tuesday at 8 a.m. That's when we're open. It's even just those little things go a long way in helping build that trust and that safety, and guarantees that people will come back for the care that they need. Okay, so this was taken from, this was actually a nurse from a study that they did. They just asked people, like, what do you think is important when it comes to, being trauma informed? So this is just one person's quote. It said, of course, when it comes to trauma-informed care, our main concern is not to re-traumatize people, but overall, it's just easier for everyone if people have a good experience or have as close as possible to resembling a good experience. So I think it's just kind of critical if we can do our best to not do things that might trigger people in a traumatic way. So yeah, again, it's just those small interactions that people have, especially if they've had trauma. It helps build resiliency. It's like, okay, I know I had all these, terrible experiences before, but this was a really good one. And it helps build that safety and that ability to trust people. I will say, like, on a personal note, I had a nurse and doctor experience that was pretty powerful for me. I was like, because I, like everybody, you're always kind of nervous when you're going to the doctor. It's like, oh, am I going to get like good news, bad news? And I was just going for like a normal, checkup, but I was asked to, to get on the scale, and I was like, oh, great. I had an attitude immediately. I was like, why do I have to get on the scale? This is the last thing I wanted today. And the nurse was kind of like, oh, shoot, like taken aback by it, because I had just, I was just being a brat and didn't want to get on there. And she was super nice about it. She was kind of like, well, this is just what we do. Sorry, like nobody warned you we were going to be getting your weight today. And I just, had an attitude and went into the, exam room and waited for the doctor. And they did talk about it, the nurse and the doctor, because the doctor came in and was like, I'm so sorry about that. Like, I hope you can always, refuse to be weighed. And she's like, there are days when I don't want to get on the scale either. So I know how that feels. And it made me feel so much better. It's just that interaction was like simple, but for her to acknowledge how I felt about it meant a lot. So now I'm like, yep, I always want to see that doctor from now on, because I wasn't treated like, it was a bad thing, even though, it seemed insignificant at the time, but, just me on that day did not want to get on the scale. So, it was nice to have the doctor just sympathize with that or empathize with it. Right. So again, that's just kind of a simple little story, but it is just a small interaction that makes a big difference. So I thought I would just share that with everybody. Okay, I know we don't have a whole lot of time, maybe like 20 minutes left. So I'm going to try to speed through some of this. But I like this. I mean, people are always like, what is it? What does it mean to be trauma informed? It's really just commit to a new way of thinking about trauma. And this is kind of you'll probably see this the more and more you do trauma trainings. It's changing the question, right? This is kind of the thing you hear all the time. This isn't something I came up with. It's actually used a lot, but the question is, we stop asking what's wrong with you? Like, what is wrong with this person? And think instead like, oh, I wonder what happened. Like if somebody's having a bad day, it's usually not about us at all. It's not like, what's wrong with you? They're going through something, right? And maybe it's not even something from today. Maybe it's something from 10 years ago, but that's the beginning of becoming trauma informed, is when we, are always thinking this instead of this. So I have a quick little video here on empathy. You guys have probably seen this. It's Brene Brown, but I like to show it. Sorry if you've already seen it. It's pretty popular, but I think it does a good job on just the power of empathy. And if we can just give this to people, that's being trauma informed, right? So I see we have oh, good. Somebody has already seen it. Oh, it's Emily. Okay. Thanks, Emily.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, I'm down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Oops, it doesn't want to let me switch slides here. There we go. Okay. I always like that because I think that is so powerful that a lot of the time that's what people need is just to feel that connection or feel felt. And that's, the beginning of healing. For time's sake, because I want us to have time for questions, I won't spend too much time on this. I mean, this PTG or post-traumatic growth is when people get to a place where they're able to see the trauma that they went through as something that I won't say helped them, because we don't ever want to say that somebody, it's kind of like that, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. No, because some terrible things just never should have happened and people shouldn't have had to, grow from them. Right. So we want to make that very clear. But there are people who have used the trauma that they've experienced to help others, and help themselves too. So I won't say that we want to put this out there for everybody like, well, there's such thing as PTG and that's where you need to be, because this takes a lot of time. It's very difficult for people to use trauma as something that may make them feel like they're a better you. So it's just, I always want to be careful with this too, because I have worked with people who, for example, one person, who was violently sexually assaulted, used that trauma to go on and help others who've experienced that go through the legal system. Right. So it's like for her, she was like, yep, this, I can identify with this. Whereas I've worked with others who are like, no, don't tell me that that's, something that I need to use to help me, because it's like, I never want to think about it again. And it haunts me. And, there is no good that came from this. Right. So we want to, again, it's like the two perspectives that we want to be careful of, if that makes sense. So I just have a little bit here on self-care. I know anytime people see self-care, we're like, oh, great. They're going to tell me to take bubble baths, but it's more than that, really. Right. It's not to shame people, to be like, well, you're not taking care of yourself, that's why you're stressed. But I just want people to know that it's, it is something that we deserve, to have some time for ourselves to do things that make us feel good, and make us feel like we're taken care of. So we have these this is something I use in my parenting classes. We call it the spices of life. I know that sounds kind of cheesy too, but it's, these are needs that are common to all people. Right. And so it's doing that little self check-in with ourselves. This is also something we can teach others, but it's, if we're not practicing it, it's really not valuable for anybody else. But I think, anytime our behavior, or let's say we're flipping our lid, anytime something is off, it's a sign that one of these needs isn't met. Right. So I always ask people to do this little self-reflection of think about like what are one or two ways we get our social needs met, physical, and so on. The spirituality, I mean, that can be as simple as being out in the woods, or fishing. A lot of the time people are like, well, I don't like that because I don't want it, I'm not religious. And, if we're religious, that's great. If we find that sense of connection at church, that's great, but it's not for everybody either. So it's just finding that, that connection or meaning to our life. Right. So I will say that for everybody, this is different. For somebody who maybe is a extrovert, they might think about like the social part of their needs as being like on a scale of 100%, they might be like, yep, that's 50% of my needs. Right. Whereas somebody who's maybe more introverted is like, nope, that's only 10% of my needs. And I'm more about, doing, creativity and the spirituality, right? It might be combined at 50%. So it's just, again, very individual. So, but it is a good reminder for us to check in, especially when we're having moments of, flipping our lid. I think I shared this story. Emily probably heard this, but when I first started doing this, I was catching myself all the time, like, oh, what need isn't met now? Because I was driving with my son, just like rushing around. It was, early in the morning, trying to get him to school. I was running on just caffeine. And I like yelled at this old lady who was, I at the time didn't know that, but she was like trying to turn and I was waiting for her to get around. And I yelled like, hurry up, grandma. And when she turned, my son saw her in the car. He was like, oh, mom, it wasn't grandma. So it was just like, oh no, this is a reminder. Like something is off here. Like I need to go and eat something and calm down, listen to some music or something, because this is now affecting, my child who's watching me behave this way. So again, it's not to beat ourselves up, but I think it's a good reminder to keep something like this in our, bedside table or as our bookmark or something to remind ourselves to check in. Like, what am I doing to get my needs met? These are the Center for Youth Wellness has all these, these kind of go in with the spices. I won't spend too much time on this, but these are also seen as, important for people, to have in their lives in order to remain well. And then where are we at for time? We have 10 minutes, so I'll just hurry up with this. These are just more little tips. It's just remember that this is different for everybody, right? It takes time for us to come up with our own little practice or routine. And eventually we find things that work for us and things that don't. I will say we do actually have to plan. If I don't put things in my calendar or schedule things, they don't happen. I'm like, yeah, we should get together. And then it never happens, right? So we really actually do have to plan it out and make that time. Be conscious of what you do, why, how it feels, what the outcomes are. If something's like not working, it's like, okay, well, this isn't really my thing then. And that's okay. And you can find something else. I like the create a no list. It's something I'm working on is like, don't check your emails on the weekend or past 5. Even though you get the notification on your phone, it's nope, I don't need to do that unless, I'm on call or said I would. It's not that we have to ignore responsibilities, but it's okay to say no to things that, you don't like to do. And then I always like this one too. We all know laughter is the best medicine. So it's again, kind of like the planning thing, but look for opportunities to actually laugh. I always joke that it's like, maybe I should watch something funny instead of a true crime show, so it's those little things that just help kind of, I won't say trick our brain, but we do know that things like laughter and exercise release endorphins, in our brain, and we like those, it's those feel good hormones. So anytime we can give ourselves a little boost of that is, just beneficial to us. So I think that's the end here. I just have this one little quote. It says, if unresolved trauma can store itself in your muscles, fascia, organ cells, and the rest of your physical body, so can joy, gratitude, abundance, love, and peace. You know, your body is also a safe space. And I think that's important to remind people too. And especially if we're working with people who have a trauma history, or sometimes people call it a trauma load, it's there are things that we can practice to feel better, you know, and there are safe people out there, and we can be that person, you know, that helps them see that there, you know, are safe, loving, trusting people out there that do care. And it makes a big difference. So that is the end. I have this last little quote by Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers. It's just basically, you know, being able to share our story with somebody that we trust makes us feel like we're not alone. And that's how healing begins. So I will end with that. These are all the, just some more resources and stuff. These are the books that I talked about. I didn't talk about this one, but it's also a good one on ACEs. So yeah, I will get this to Emily to email out to everybody. So that is it. I'm surprised I finished on time with questions. I had so many, I was like 45 slides. We made it.
That was good. Yeah, we definitely encourage any questions or any, you know, any experiences you've had in your profession where, like I said, that this might apply or something that might be helpful. You can also use the chat box if you'd like. But thank you so much, Ivy.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. I hope this answered some of your questions in your field of work. I know it probably wasn't everything. I'm always happy to share my email if people want to reach out with anything specific that I didn't cover.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll make sure that everyone gets resources and everything and has your email address as well so they can reach out later.
Okay, great.
Hey, this is
go ahead.
B-Rad in Missoula, and I just remember when you mentioned something about I forget the exact term, but the concept was growing out of trauma.
Yeah,
you can't go ahead.
Post-traumatic growth. Yeah,
post-traumatic growth. That reminds me of Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning. And for those of you who don't know, Viktor Frankl found the meaning of life as a Jewish prisoner in a German concentration camp during World War II. And he came out with this form of psychotherapy called existential psychotherapy, which was later turned into logotherapy, logos being the Greek word for meaning. And I think that a key component of that post-traumatic stress, whatever it is.
Yeah, post-traumatic growth. I know it's
post-traumatic growth.
Yeah.
At least in his context is like not like that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but finding meaning in the suffering.
Yeah.
For what it's worth. I thought I'd share that thought.
No,
Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that that's really helpful. I want to look into that some more, because I think when people know that then they may be able to find the meaning rather than, think of it as like something that they just have to be strong because of. But yeah, do you mind typing that in the chat? That man's name? Because I'm going to screenshot it here. I'm going to look into it.
Thank you, B-Rad. And I did put a link to our really short evaluation survey in the chat. There we go, Viktor Frankl. And so if everyone can just take a moment and fill out that survey, that just helps us see how we're doing and what we can make better and what we can keep doing well. And I share that with our trainer, of course, as well. So thank you, everyone, for coming. Again, feel free to ask any other questions before we wrap up. But it was great to have you. And thank you so much, Ivy, even though you're sick. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just going to be rehydrating, and that's all I can do, right? Rest and drink lots of water.
Good.
But
Take it easy.
You all. Thanks for bearing with my voice.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, well, have a good day, everybody. Thank you.